The Texas sun hung low over the dusty plains, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch of her small adobe house, watching the day fade into evening. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth, a smell she had grown to love in the 3 years since she had moved to this remote corner of the frontier. She was a widow now, alone on the land that she and her husband Thomas had claimed together. He had been gone for 2 years, taken by fever one harsh winter. Most people had expected her to return east back to civilization and safety. But Sarah had stayed. This land had become her home, and she was not one to abandon what was hers. The sound of hoofbeats broke the evening silence. Sarah turned to see a group of riders approaching fast, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. She recognized some of them from town, rough men, the kind who spent more time drinking than working. They were led by a man named Caleb Stone, a rancher with a reputation for cruelty. They thundered past her property without stopping, heading north toward the Rocky Hills. She watched them go, feeling uneasy. Nothing good ever came from men riding that hard with guns drawn. An hour later, as darkness settled over the land, Sarah heard a different sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across earth. She picked up her lantern and walked toward the small barn behind her house. What she found made her breath catch. A man lay crumpled against the barn wall, barely conscious. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages on his shoulder and side. His skin was bronze, his long black hair matted with sweat and dirt. He wore leather leggings and moccasins, and a turquoise pendant hung around his neck. He was Comanche. Sarah knew she should be afraid. The Comanche were feared across Texas, known as fierce warriors who defended their land with deadly skill. But as she looked at this man, all she saw was someone who would die without help. She made her decision quickly. Using all her strength, Sarah helped him into the barn and onto a bed of hay. She brought water and clean cloth, working by lamplight to clean his wounds. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, which was a blessing, but he had lost a lot of blood. His breathing was shallow and labored. As she worked, his eyes opened briefly. They were dark and intelligent, filled with pain but also with a fierce will to survive. He said something in his own language, words she could not understand. Then his eyes closed again. Sarah stayed with him through the night, keeping watch. She knew the risk she was taking. If Caleb Stone and his men came back and found a Comanche hiding in her barn, they would likely hang them both. The law, such as it was out here, did not look kindly on those who helped the Indians, but Sarah had never been one to let fear dictate her choices. By morning, the man's fever had broken. His breathing was steadier and some color had returned to his face. Sarah brought him water and a thin broth, which he managed to swallow. He watched her with those dark eyes, saying nothing. But she could sense his awareness of her, his understanding that she had saved his life. "You need to rest," she told him, knowing he probably could not understand her words, but hoping her tone conveyed her meaning. "You are safe here." She left him to tend to her morning chores, feeding the chickens and checking on her small vegetable garden. The sun was already hot, promising another scorching day. That was when she saw them. They appeared as if from nowhere, materializing out of the landscape itself. Warriors on horseback, arranged in a wide circle around her property. Sarah counted at least 20 of them, maybe more. They sat perfectly still, watching her house with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Her heart hammered in her chest. This was what she had feared, what she had known might happen. They had come for their wounded brother. Sarah walked slowly back to her house, trying not to show her fear. She could feel their eyes on her with every step. Once inside, she leaned against the door, her hands shaking. She thought about running, about trying to flee. But where would she go? They had surrounded her completely. Besides, the wounded man in her barn was in no condition to be moved. Running would solve nothing, so Sarah did the only thing she could think of. She walked to the barn. The wounded warrior was awake, propped up against the wall. When he saw her face, he seemed to understand immediately what was happening outside. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, gesturing toward the door. Sarah shook her head. "I am not going to hand you over to be killed," she said firmly. "You stay here and rest." She returned to her house and waited. The morning stretched into afternoon. The warriors remained in their positions, unmoving as statues. Sarah went about her work, refusing to be paralyzed by fear. She swept the floors, prepared a simple meal, and tended to her patient in the barn. The warriors watched but did not approach. As evening fell again, something changed. A single rider detached from the circle and walked his horse slowly toward the house. He was older than the others, his face weathered and marked with the signs of a lifetime of leadership. He wore a headdress of eagle feathers and carried himself with unmistakable authority. Sarah stepped out onto her porch to meet him. The chief, for surely that was what he was, stopped his horse a respectful distance away. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke in surprisingly clear English. "You have our warrior," he said. It was not a question. Sarah lifted her chin. "I have a wounded man in my barn who would have died without care. I gave him that care because it was the right thing to do." The chief nodded slowly. "You are alone here," he observed. "I am. You were not afraid to help him, even knowing who he was, even knowing we would come." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I was afraid," she admitted. "But fear is not a reason to let someone die." Something shifted in the chief's expression. It was subtle, but Sarah saw it, a hint of respect, perhaps even approval. "The man in your barn is my son," the chief said. "He was shot by white men who hunt us for sport. You could have let him die. You could have turned him over to those men, but you chose mercy instead." Sarah said nothing, waiting. The chief gestured and several warriors dismounted. They walked to the barn and Sarah tensed, ready to protest. But they moved with care, gathering their wounded companion gently. The son looked at Sarah as they carried him past, and he spoke words in his language that she understood without translation. "Thank you." The chief reached into a pouch at his side and removed something. He leaned down and placed it on her porch, a beautifully crafted knife in a beaded sheath and several bundles of dried meat. "You showed honor to my son," he said. "We do not forget such debts. You will not be harmed by our people. If you need help, show this knife. It will be known." Then he did something that surprised Sarah even more. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep respect. Sarah returned the gesture. The warriors mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering darkness, taking their wounded brother with them. Within minutes they had vanished as completely as if they had never been there at all. Sarah stood on her porch long after they had gone, the knife in her hands. The weight of what had happened settled over her slowly. She had saved a life, and in doing so, had forged an unexpected connection across a divide that most thought unbridgeable. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt something she had not felt in a long time, not quite peace, but something close to it. She had chosen mercy over fear, compassion over prejudice, and she had been met with honor in return. The frontier was a harsh place, full of violence and misunderstanding. But tonight, in this small corner of Texas, two peoples had found a moment of mutual respect. Sarah picked up the gifts and went inside, knowing that she would sleep well for the first time in many nights. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, as all days did on the frontier. But tonight she had hope.